The wind in the Wyoming territory doesn't just blow. It hunts. It finds the cracks in your cabin walls, the holes in your boots, and the secrets you thought you buried under the permafrost. Silas Vance knew all about secrets. He'd spent 15 years on the edge of the Bitterroot Range, speaking more to his horse than any living soul in the town of Oakhaven. Before we find out if Silas Vance has the strength to do the unthinkable, pull up a chair. If you find yourself drawn to these tales of the Old West, stories of grit, silent heroes, and the kind of justice that doesn't always come from a badge, then you're among friends. Take a second to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. It helps us keep these fires burning out here in the wilderness. And while you're at it, tell me in the comments, what time is it where you are? And are you listening from a place as quiet as Silas's ranch? Now, let's go back to the Bitterroot Range, where the silence was about to be broken by the sound of a town watching in horror. He was a man made of granite and old scars. A man who thought he'd seen the worst the world could throw at a person. But that Tuesday, when the sun was nothing but a bruised purple smear against the horizon, the world threw something new at him. She didn't walk onto his land. She crawled. Her dress was a rag of blue calico, stained so dark with red it looked black in the twilight. She didn't scream. She didn't have the breath for it. She just collapsed against a hitching post, her fingers clutching a jagged, rusted piece of a broken iron shackle that was still embedded deep in her side. Silas stood on his porch, the shadow of his hat hiding eyes that had seen too many battlefields. His hands, usually as steady as a mountain, felt a strange, cold tremor, because he knew that girl, and he knew the man who had put that iron in her. Oakhaven wasn't a town of mercy. It was a town of rules, and the rule was, you don't touch what belongs to the Blackwood family. But as Silas looked down at her, the girl sobbed a plea that would set the whole territory on fire. "Please," she whispered, her voice a dry rattle. "It's the only way to stop the bleeding. Just put it in. Put the heat on it. Silas, please." Silas Vance didn't ask questions. In the West, questions got people killed faster than a stray bullet. He picked the girl up. She was light, too light, like a bird with its wings clipped. He carried her into the cabin, the smell of wood smoke and old leather rising to meet them. He laid her on the heavy oak table. The jagged iron shard in her side was an ugly thing. It was a piece of a branding shackle, the kind the Blackwoods use on their indentured workers at the silver mine. It was designed to stay in, to fester, to make sure no one got far. "Sarah," Silas said, his voice like grinding stones. It was the first time he'd said her name in 3 years. She looked at him, her green eyes clouded with a pain so deep it made Silas's stomach twist. "They're coming, Silas. Elias Blackwood. He said if I ran, he'd make an example. He's coming for his iron." Silas walked to the hearth. He didn't look back. He took a long, thin iron rod used for tending the coals. He thrust it into the heart of the blue flame fire. He didn't have a doctor's kit. He didn't have morphine. Out here, you had 3 things: whiskey, fire, and the will to survive. "He can come," Silas muttered. He reached for a bottle of cheap rye. He poured a glass and held it to her lips. "Drink. All of it." She choked it down, her body shivering. The cabin was warm, but she was ice cold. Shock was setting in. He could see the grayness creeping into her skin. If he pulled that iron out now, she'd bleed out on his floor in 3 minutes. The shard was acting like a plug, but it was poisoned. The only way to save her was to remove the metal and immediately seal the wound with white-hot heat. A cautery. It was a brutal medieval bit of business that no man wanted to perform on a person he cared for. His hands trembled. Silas Vance, who held a rifle steady while 100 rebels charged his line at Shiloh, couldn't stop his fingers from shaking. "I can't," he whispered to the empty room. "You have to," Sarah sobbed, reaching out, her bloody hand gripping his forearm. "Please, Silas, just put it in, before I lose a nerve, before the dark takes me." Outside, the wind died down. In the West, that was always a bad sign. It meant the pressure was changing. It meant the predators were close enough to be heard. Silas heard them. 3 horses, maybe 4. They weren't galloping. They were walking. Arrogant. They knew she couldn't go far. They knew Silas was just one man. He looked at the iron rod in the fire. It was starting to glow a dull, angry orange. "Silas," Sarah whispered. Her eyes were fluttering, closing. He didn't have time to wait for the proper moment. He grabbed a clean cloth and a heavy leather strap. "Bite on this," he commanded. He didn't wait for her to agree. He wedged the leather between her teeth. He gripped the jagged shard in her side with a pair of blackened pliers. With one swift, agonizing motion, he pulled. Sarah's back arched off the table. A muffled, soul-tearing scream died in the leather strap. The blood started. It wasn't a trickle. It was a fountain. It soaked Silas's shirt instantly. He dropped the pliers and grabbed the glowing iron rod. This was the moment. The horror the title spoke of wasn't just a pain. It was a choice. To save her, he had to hurt her more than her captors ever had. "Forgive me," he breathed. He pressed a white-hot iron into the open wound. The sound was like a drop of water on a hot skillet. The cabin filled with a thick, acrid smoke. Sarah's eyes rolled back in her head, and she went limp. Silas held it there for 3 seconds. They were the longest 3 seconds of his life. When he finally pulled the rod away, the bleeding had stopped. The wound was a puckered, black mark, a scar that would tell a story of survival, but a scar nonetheless. Silas sat back on a wooden stool, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his hands. They were covered in her blood and soot. And then the heavy thud of a boot hit his porch. "Vance!" A voice boomed. It was Elias Blackwood, a man who owned the bank, the law, and half the souls in Oakhaven. "I know you got my property in there. Bring her out, and maybe I won't burn that shack down with you in it." We're at the edge of the blade now. Silas Vance has saved the girl's life, but he's invited the devil to his doorstep. If you've ever had to make a choice that you knew would change your life forever, a choice between staying safe and doing what was right, tell me about it in the comments. I read every one. And if you're enjoying the tension, make sure you've given this video a like. It tells the algorithm that these Western stories still matter. Back to the Bitterroot. Silas didn't reach for his shotgun. Not yet. He walked to the door and opened it. Elias Blackwood sat atop a black stallion, flanked by 2 hired guns with silver stars pinned to their vests. "Fake law. Paid for law. She's not property, Elias," Silas said, stepping onto the porch. He looked remarkably calm for a man whose shirt was drenched in fresh blood. "She's got my iron on her side, Silas. That makes her mine by contract," Blackwood sneered. "The iron is out," Silas said. He reached into his pocket and tossed a jagged, bloody shard into the dirt at the horse's feet. "And the wound is sealed. She's too weak to move. If you want her, you'll have to wait until she can stand. Or you can try to take her past me." Blackwood looked at the shard. He looked at Silas. He knew Silas's reputation. He knew Silas was a man who didn't miss. "Fine," Blackwood said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "We won't take her here. We'll wait for the law. Real law. We'll have a trial in Oakhaven tomorrow. Fugitive Slave Act. Silas. You remember that? If she's found guilty of theft of her own labor, she goes back to the mine, and you go to the gallows to harbor her." Blackwood turned his horse. "See you in town, old man. Bring her in the wagon. If you don't show, we'll come back with 30 men and a gallon of kerosene." The next morning, the town of Oakhaven was gathered in the square. It was a cold, gray morning. The air tasted of wet slate. Silas drove the wagon into the center of the square. Sarah sat in the back, wrapped in Silas's heavy wool coat, her face pale as a ghost. The townspeople watched. They didn't cheer. They didn't jeer. They watched in a terrifying, heavy silence. They knew what the Blackwoods did. They knew about the mine. But they were afraid. Fear is a powerful lock on a man's mouth. Elias Blackwood stood on the steps of the courthouse, the sheriff beside him. "Silas Vance," the sheriff called out. "Bring the girl forward." Silas helped Sarah down. She stumbled, her side burning with every step. "This girl is accused of breaking a legal contract and theft of mining equipment." Blackwood announced to the crowd. "Look at her. She's a runner. She carries the mark of a thief. She carries the mark of a coward. Silas's voice rang out across the square. He stepped in front of her. "Your mark, Elias." The crowd shifted. "She has a wound," Silas continued, his voice growing louder, more steady. "A wound caused by a Blackwood shackle. A shackle that's illegal in this territory as of 3 months ago. I know, because I got the letter from the governor's office myself." Blackwood's face turned a deep, angry red. "You're lying." "Am I?" Silas reached into the wagon and pulled out a heavy leather bag. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a stack of papers. "I've been quiet for 15 years, Elias. You thought I was just a hermit. But a man alone has a lot of time to write letters. A man alone has a lot of time to keep records of every pound of silver you didn't tax, and every man you buried in the hillside without a name." The town watched in horror as Silas began to read. He didn't read about Sarah. He read about the town sons, about the debts that were never paid, about the accidents in the mine. The horror wasn't the blood on Sarah's dress anymore. The horror was the mirror Silas was holding up to the town. He was showing them exactly what they had allowed to happen while they kept their heads down. He saved her. A woman's voice called out from the back of the crowd. It was the baker's wife. "I saw him drive in. He stayed up all night. Look at his hands. They're still burned from the iron he used to save her life." Silas held up his hands. The palms were blistered. He had held the hot end of the rod to keep it steady. "I did what any man with a soul would do," Silas said. "I put the heat to the wound. Now the question is this town brave enough to do the same? Are you going to let the rot stay in Oakhaven, or are you going to put the iron to it?" The sheriff looked at Blackwood. Then he looked at the papers in Silas's hand. He looked at the crowd, which was no longer silent. They were murmuring. The murmur was turning into a roar. Elias Blackwood reached for his sidearm. He was a man used to being the only one with power. He never cleared leather. Silas didn't even draw his own gun. He just stepped forward, his shadow falling over Blackwood like the coming of a long overdue winter. "Don't," Silas said. Just one word. Blackwood froze. He saw the eyes of the town on him. For the first time in his life, he saw that they weren't afraid of him anymore. They were disgusted by him. The sheriff stepped forward and took Blackwood's gun. "I think we'll have that trial, Elias. But it won't be the girl in the dock. It'll be you. Healing is a slow business. It doesn't happen in a day, and it doesn't happen without a scar." A month later, Sarah was sitting on Silas's porch. The color had come back to her cheeks. She was planting herbs near the hitching post, lavender and sage, things that smelled of life instead of smoke. Silas was mending a fence. His hands were still scarred, the skin tough and shiny where the heat had taken it. He didn't talk much about that day in town. He didn't have to. The Blackwoods were gone. The mine was under new management that paid in coin instead of iron. Sarah looked up as Silas walked toward the porch. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Losing your peace? The whole town knows who you are now." Silas took off his hat and wiped his brow. He looked out at the Bitterroot Range, the peaks covered in fresh, white snow. "Peace isn't the absence of trouble, Sarah," he said, his voice as warm as the morning sun. "It's knowing you did the right thing when the trouble came knocking. I'd take the burn 1,000 times over to see you sitting there today." He sat on the step beside her. 2 people, 1 ranch, and a slow healing that didn't need permission from anyone. Out here in the West, stories don't always end in gunfire. Sometimes they end in the quiet rhythm of 2 people finally learning how to breathe again. If this story meant something to you, don't forget to leave a comment and let me know. We tell these stories because they remind us that no matter how deep the wound, there's always a way to seal it. Until the next trail, friend, keep your water skin full and your heart steady. We'll see you in the next one.